I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 4, Sunday, June 23rd, 2024. The lesson is entitled Ruth Meets Boaz. Lesson text comes from Ruth chapter 2, verses 8 through 18. Related scriptures are Ruth 2, 1 through 7, Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, Deuteronomy 24, 19 through 22, 1 Timothy 6, 17 through 19. The place is Bethlehem. The time is between 1120 and 1130 BC. Kindness is a trait that must mark the Christian. Our lesson this week teaches us to show kindness to those who are less well off than we are. Today's aim, facts. To learn how Boaz took care of the needs of poor Ruth and showed kindness to her. Principle, to affirm that God blesses those who take care of those who are poor and needy. Application, to urge students to take care of the less well off and to show kindness to them. Illustrating the lesson, God rewarded Ruth's decision to follow him. She entered into a personal relationship with a personal God who provided for her through Boaz and made her a part of his community. He always rewards faith and faithfulness. Practical points. 1. The godly person does what he can to help the poor and needy. Ruth 2, 8 through 9. Matthew 25, 34 through 40. 2. The grateful respond in humility and not with a sense of entitlement. Ruth 2, 10. 3. Be kind to others. God is watching and will reward your faithful obedience. Ruth 2, 11 through 12. Luke 6, 35. Ephesians 6, 2. 4. God supplies all we need when we need it. Ruth 2, 13 through 14. Psalms 23, 1. Philippians 4, 19. 5. The godly person both gives and keeps his word. Ruth 2, 15 through 16. 6. God blesses us and others through our diligent work. Verses 17 through 18. Golden text. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward will be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Ruth 2:12. Today we have two lesson outlines. The first is generosity from the wealthy, Ruth 2, 8 through 13. The second is provision for the needy, Ruth 2, 14 through 18. Introduction. We have a good God who is in control of all our circumstances, and when good things happen for us, it is because he has orchestrated it. The first chapter of Ruth begins with three widows stranded in Moab. Two traveled from there to Judea, the home of the older woman, Naomi. The entire first chapter sets the scene for the major events of the book that are about to unfold. Two important facts prepare the way for what follows. First, the women arrived in Judea at the time of barley harvest, verse 22. Second, Naomi had a wealthy relative named Boaz, 2:1. These form the basis for all that follows. Naomi and Ruth were destitute. So, to help meet their needs, Ruth requested and received permission from Naomi to go out into neighboring fields to glean. God providentially led her to the fields of Boaz, who inquired about her upon returning from town. His servants gave him a good report about Ruth and her work. Generosity from the wealthy. Ruth 2, 8. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here, fast by my maidens. Verse 9. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee, And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Verse 10. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? Verse 11. And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come into a people which thou knowest not heretofore. Verse 12. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward will be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Verse 13. Then said she, Let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord, for that thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto thine handmaiden, though it be not like unto one of thine handmaidens. Boaz taking care of Ruth. Ruth 2, 8 through 9. When Boaz came to the fields, he immediately noticed Ruth. Worsby creatively images. No sooner had Boaz greeted his workers than his eyes caught the presence of a stranger in the field, and a lovely stranger at that. I get the impression that when he saw her, it was love at first sight. For from that point on, Boaz focuses his interest on Ruth and not on the harvest. Though an alien, Ruth was an eligible young woman whom the young men of town would notice. 3:10. The good report Boaz received about Ruth from his workers, Ruth 2, 6 through 7, was what really impressed him. He had already heard about her, verse 11, so he knew she was a loyal woman of integrity. He also knew she was related to him through marriage, so she had a special concern for her welfare. When he approached her, the first thing he did was get her full attention. Hearest thou not, my daughter? Verse 8. We might say, please listen carefully. What he had to say was important enough that she must not miss it. By addressing Ruth as his daughter, Boaz was probably making reference to the age difference between them, as well as the fact that they were indirectly related. He was probably closer to Naomi's age than Ruth's. There is a hint of this in the next chapter, where Boaz mentions that Ruth could have gone after younger men than he. His particular instruction at their initial meeting was that she remain in his field and do all her gleaning there. Boaz's mention of his maidens refers to the young women who worked for him alongside the reapers. The reapers were young men who cut the grain using hand sickles, after which the young women tied up the sheaves. Gleaners were never employees of the owner. Rather, they were poor who were permitted to gather whatever was left behind by those gathering. Boaz was telling Ruth she could stay in his field and close to the young women employed by him. This was a very generous proposition that would give her an advantage over other gleaners. Boaz added two other words of encouragement. He knew the young men who worked for him would be prone to take advantage of an attractive young foreign woman, so he assured Ruth that he had given specific instructions to them to leave her alone. That would relieve any stress that might have arisen from unwanted attention and allow her the freedom to concentrate on her work. His other instruction was that she should feel free to drink from the vessels of water drawn by his young men for his employees. Ruth wondering why. Ruth 2:10. Everything that had happened up to that point in Ruth's life reveals that she was not a proud woman, but a sincerely humble one. When Boaz gave these instructions and reassurances that she was welcome not only to glean in his field but also to receive the benefits of his employees, she was understandably humbled and grateful. She bowed clear down to the ground and asked Boaz why he should give her such attention, especially since she was not an Israelite but a Moabite. It might be that Naomi had been treated negatively in Moab, as foreigners often were, and perhaps Ruth had expected the same now that she was in Judea. She might have approached the whole thought of gleaning with a sense of dread, knowing she could easily be rejected by many of the local people. Boaz's generous, thoughtful treatment was a pleasant surprise to her, and she could not understand why it was being granted to her. Both her actions and her words communicated a deep sense of gratitude. Boaz explaining his actions, Ruth 2:11 through 12. Boaz's response was to let Ruth know that he had heard detailed reports about her previous actions toward her mother in law since the death of her husband. Specifically, he said that he had heard that she had left her own parents and the land of her birth to accompany Naomi back to her homeland, which was for Ruth a foreign land. He recognized that for her to do that meant she had come to a people she had never known before. It was a statement of sympathetic understanding. Boaz made it clear to Ruth that he knew what she had done was not easy. He appears to have been genuinely moved by her sacrificial actions. This led him to pronounce a blessing upon her. Boaz expressed his desire that God would reward Ruth for what she had done. He desired God's richest blessings on her life because she had put her trust in him. She had done what Paul later said the Thessalonians had done when they turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. 1 Thessalonians 1:9. Boaz pronounced a benediction upon Ruth for her loyalty to Naomi and her deceased husband, asking the Lord's protection for her as a bird's wing protects her chicks. The likening of God to a bird conveys that God keeps his children warm and safe. Psalms 36:7 reminds us, how excellent is thy loving kindness, O God. Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of thy wings. Nothing can harm us without God's specific permission, as demonstrated in the example of Job. Satan could not touch him unless God allowed it. Job 1 through 2. Boaz was acknowledging that Ruth would be safe and provided for under God's care. Ruth's expressing appreciation, Ruth 2:13. John W. Reed writes, though Boaz's words could have stirred her to pride, Ruth continued to respond in humility. Naomi had given no words of encouragement to Ruth, but this man spoke comforting words that warmed her soul. She mentioned her gratitude for his favor, verses 2 and 10. Comfort and kind words and hope they would continue. She felt she was less important than Boaz's servant girls. Worsby writes, Ruth's response to Boaz was one of humility and gratitude. She acknowledged her own unworthiness and accepted his grace. She believed his promises and rejoiced in them. There was no need for Ruth to worry, for the wealthy Lord of the harvest would care for her and Naomi. How did she know he would care for her? He gave her his promise, and she knew he could be trusted. There is an obvious parallel in these thoughts with the way we can trust the Lord to care for us. Ruth's statement was a combination of gratitude and confidence about her future. Her desire to find favor in Boaz's eyes was an expression of her desire to continue to please him and not become a disappointment. She had been comforted and encouraged by his kind words, and she wanted to remain worthy of his goodness to her. What amazed her the most was that he was doing all this for her in spite of the fact that she was not one of his hired maidens. Provision for the needy. Verse 14. And Boaz said unto her, at mealtime come thou hither, and eat of thy bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. Verse 15. And when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. Verse 16. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. Verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Verse 18. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. Boaz's invitation to Ruth. Ruth 2:14. When lunchtime came, Ruth got another surprise. It was doubtful she had taken any food with her. She had no idea where she would end up, and possibly just planned to get through the day without eating until she got back home. Poverty creates situations in which necessity takes over, and as one has to adjust accordingly. Boaz unexpectedly invited Ruth to eat lunch with him and the reapers. This is another indication of the large hearted character of Boaz. He was personal with his employees and set to eat with them, something that many owners may not have done. If there was any reluctance on the part of the reapers about having Ruth working among them and then being invited to eat with them, it must have disappeared when Boaz himself served Ruth some food. He had invited her to eat the bread and dip it in the vinegar right along with everyone else. The vinegar was a sour beverage into which the hard bread was dipped, making it easier to eat. Some form of roasted grain was also available. Boaz personally served this to Ruth. Ruth was able to eat as much as she wanted. We cannot help imagining that this must have been quite a luxury to her. After prolonged famine and hard times in Moab, while Ruth 2:14 indicates that she ate until satisfied and then left, a comparison with the end of verse 18 reveals that she had some food left over, which she kept and took home for Naomi. It was quite obvious to her and all those around her that Boaz had become her protector and provider. Little did he know at that point how much farther God would take him in being this protector. Boaz's command to his servants, Ruth 2:15 through 16. Apparently, Ruth did not linger after the meal, but returned immediately to her work. In this, we see her diligence and commitment to what she knew needed to be done. The more she gleaned, the more she and Naomi would have for their sustenance. She obviously was not a lazy person. Ruth was not one of those people who expect others to always be meeting their needs. Some folks are givers and others are takers. Ruth was not a taker, but was willing to work for what she received. The Mosaic law required farmers to allow for gleaners. Leviticus 19:9 through 10 says, and when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. This is repeated in Leviticus 23:22 and again in Deuteronomy 24:19 through 21, with the added promise that God would bless the one who obeys this. Boaz diligently obeyed this law. As soon as Ruth had returned to her work, Boaz gave further instructions to her reapers. What he told them went far beyond the norm when it came to the treatment of gleaners. Instead of being kept to the parameters of the fields and behind the reapers, Ruth was to be allowed among the reapers themselves and was not to be scolded when she went there. Furthermore, Boaz's reapers were instructed to occasionally drop some stalks of grain on purpose for her to pick up. There was certainly nothing like this included in the law. Boaz was demonstrating great compassion for Ruth and Naomi in his determination to meet their needs. His obvious respect for Ruth and his concern for his relatives motivated him to take extreme measures toward them. Ruth's results from her work, Ruth 2:17 through 18. Ruth worked all day long, right up until evening. After she finished her gleaning, she beat out the grain from the stalks and ended up with almost an ephah of barley grain. This would have been a little over half a bushel of grain, an unheard of amount of one day's gleaning. It is certainly a tribute both to Ruth's diligence in working and to Boaz's generosity in making extra provision for her. This amount of grain would have been sufficient for Ruth and Naomi for a good many days. When Ruth returned home with her grain, she immediately showed it to her mother in law and gave her the food she had saved from the lunch with Boaz, verse 18. We can only imagine Naomi's relief when she saw that her daughter in law was safe after being gone all day. We can certainly imagine Ruth's weariness after spending hours working in Boaz's field. Naomi and Ruth rejoiced together over the way God had cared for them and met their needs. This is evident in verse 19, where we read of their excited conversation about the day. Questions. 1. What had Boaz already heard about Ruth before he met her? 2. What did Boaz tell Ruth about where to glean and what advantage did this give her? 3. What does Ruth's response to Boaz reveal about her and what she might have expected? 4. Why did Boaz say he had taken notice of Ruth? 5. How do we explain the concept of being under God's wings? Ruth 2:12. 6. How did Ruth express gratitude to Boaz for what he was doing for her? 7. What surprising events happened for Ruth at lunchtime? 8. What did Boaz command his reapers and why was this unexpected? 9. What were the results of Ruth's day of gleaning? 10. What does Ruth's large harvest say about Ruth's character and the character of Boaz? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, June 23rd, 2024. Thank you for listening. God bless.